Right, now I'm delighted to hand over to Rosie Rawlings, who's going to talk us all about planting for pollinators. So over to you, Rosie.
Thank you, Kieran. Hi, everybody. Afternoon. Sorry about the slight delay. Technical changes my end. So I'm going to talk to you about planting for pollinators. This is mainly focused at planting in gardens, but it could also be community spaces, mini meadows, things like that as well. I'm starting off with a beautiful picture of a longhorn bee, which we're lucky enough to have here locally in South Wales. I love the picture, so I thought I'd share it. I'm going to cover a little bit about my background, the nursery, insect decline, a little bit about bees, different bees and different pollinators, some research that we have just published, and based on that research, what we think are the very best plants you can plant in your gardens to be maximizing the amount of food you can provide to pollinators. So I run a small independent nursery that's in Monmouth in South Wales. And we moved here about 4 years ago. And as you can see, we have a glorious setting with plenty of rolling hills. It was actually a little bit difficult finding somewhere flat to put the polytunnel, but we just about managed. The nursery is run on very sustainable grounds. We do have to use plastic to send our plants out, but they are fully recycled and recyclable. And all our plants are grown pesticide free, peat free, and we also all the water we use is harvested from the polytunnel roof. Our setting is glorious. We're very lucky because we're in 23 acres of a mixture of wildflower meadows and bits of ancient woodland. And in addition to running the nursery, we are pretty obsessed with monitoring our local wildlife. I totally endorse what Kieran was saying about being able to get your phone out and go, oh, I think I just saw such and such, and I'll quickly record it. So we take our recording fairly seriously as well as our more formal research, and we have plenty to record. It's great. We also get involved in more formal surveys and monitoring of pollinators, this is an example of a monitoring program that I think Miranda might be touching on later. And also things like Bug Life have been running this program for many years, which is counting splatters when you do journeys, counting splatters on your number plate of your car, so that you just get a sense of the number of flying insects that are out there in the big wide world, well, UK. And that's important because it's part of national trends for knowing how many insects and flying pollinators we have. Because it's important, because insects are in decline. I won't say too much on it in case I'm overlapping with what Miranda's going to cover. But yes, that number plate splat picture I just showed you, that Bug Life run that program, they have seen a 78% decline in flying insects since 2004. That's huge. All of our insects are in decline, not just our pollinators. The key cause of this is basically industrialized agriculture causing loss of habitat. Also, there are other issues, but that's the big one. Before anybody does ask, are honeybees in decline? No. They have good years and bad years, but honeybees are they are an important part of the pollinator network, but they are essentially a farmed animal. So when we're talking about pollinators needing your help, mainly it's our wild pollinators, not honeybees. Honeybees have a great density in some places and are actually possibly part of the problem. Just to touch on bees, which I think a lot of people think are the main pollinators, the honeybee is one of our 270 UK species, 270 plus. The number changes. We have new ones arrive or new species are discovered, and at the same time, some go extinct, so we're never quite sure what the exact number is. Bumblebees, 25 species, and then all the rest of them are solitary bees. And just if people are not sure what a solitary bee is, there are obviously very numerous, but just a very typical solitary bee might go unnoticed in your garden because a lot of them, not all of them, are quite small. Just to put it in perspective, there's a honeybee and there's a little Lasioglossum solitary bee, and that's a fairly typical size, so about a third to a quarter of the size of a honeybee, which makes them probably 10% the size of a bumblebee. But pollinators are so more than just bees. They are also hoverflies, moths, butterflies, even flies and some beetles can be effective pollinators. How different all these things fit into the overall scheme of pollination. They all have different traits. Some are fluffier than others, some fly longer than others, some pollinate at night, some pollinate during the day. They all kind of have different jobs to do. I'm now going to come on to answering the question of, okay, what should you plant to help pollinators, particularly in your garden? And that is actually a picture of our research bed. Back in 2019, I completed a piece of research which Professor Dave Goulson then authored and published with us to say, this is the results of 5 years worth of work of quantifying which garden plants attract the most pollinators. We have now moved house to Monmouth. We were in Oxfordshire before, which gave us the opportunity to test those plants again in a new site. So we've now got 4 years more data, taking us to a total of 9 years. We've added in hoverflies and butterflies and moths, day-flying butterflies and moths, and posed the new question, which was, okay, we had these plants, we knew how they performed in Oxfordshire. How will moving to a new site impact the results? Our research methodology hasn't changed. We take each plant that we want to study and we grow it to fill a square meter of ground. We're only choosing plants that someone has said or we've observed ourselves are meant to be good for pollinators. You get lots of lists of people saying these are good for pollinators. And so, yes, we've been working our way through these. Clearly, there are thousands of cultivars and garden plants out there, and they will be different in different countries and different regions. But we focused on UK and recommended ones. Then, having grown your plants to fill a square meter, you go out every week that plant's in flower and do what we call the snapshot method, which is very quickly, right here, right now, how many are on there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, yeah, it seems to be about 6 butterflies and 2 honeybees. Okay. We also note some other metadata and the main pollinator groups. And you just keep doing that week in, week out for 9 years. Yeah, our research bed looks like that. Things are more or less, they are actually in square meter areas, but plants flop and move and do their own thing. But I love it. It's a nice time of my week to be out there in all that colour with the pollinators. We moved from one rural setting in Oxfordshire to a different rural setting in Monmouthshire. In both cases, we're at the edge of a village, but in Maypole, Monmouthshire, we're even more remote from that village, with mainly grazed fields around us rather than arable. So we knew there were going to be some differences having moved site. We looked at weather and we discovered, not surprisingly, that Wales was a little wetter. I probably get no prizes for that. And also, though, we found the hottest week of the year had moved. Hottest and makes sense that the driest week was also a little later. The thing I hadn't expected, and possibly that was just me being naive, was that the population of pollinators was quite different. Hanny on the red side is our Oxfordshire, and Maypole is the village name where we are now in Wales, in Monmouthshire. And as you can see from this chart, we had a significant reduction in the number of honeybees. Now, we do keep honeybees ourselves. We have a couple of hives, but we did have them in Oxfordshire. Where they are located here is a little bit further from our research beds, but I think the difference here is that from us, it's another at least a mile before you got to anybody else keeping bees, and then another 4 miles after that before you get to another person. In Oxfordshire, I think in the village there were probably 3 or 4 other honeybee keepers. So yes, lesser honeybee population, bumblebees more or less the same, and a big growth in solitary bees. And in part, that's because that we put the research bed right next to the ancient stone wall of our house, which is south facing and has lots of holes in it that make great nesting spots for solitary bees. So that's the difference in the pollinators by weeks of the year. You've got the weeks of the year along the bottom, and then average bees per square metre on the other axis. And so you can see again in Oxfordshire honey, you can see the yellow line of the bumblebees really peaking over summer and carrying on into autumn, and just the absence of that yellow line dominating a much more balanced range of pollinators in maypole. So what do all our findings mean for plants? There's 2 factors to consider. Some plants attract a lot of pollinators at the same time. So you can find a plant in your garden that is buzzing away and lots of activity, and that's great. But quite often the plants that attract a lot of pollinators at one time don't flower for very long. This is the chart, which is just average bees per square metre. This is not research findings, it's just a stepping stone. Sedum spectabile, which I know has been renamed, but I can't cope with the new name, apologies, came top. There was one year where on one day, I found 105, mostly honeybees, on a single square metre of that plant. It was an extreme year, but there you go. But then some plants flower for very much longer than others. Some plants, the one here at the top is there's a Rosymum Bowles Mauve that we've known flower on and off for about 26 weeks. And you can see other plants which have got much shorter bars and only flower for 3 or 4 weeks. Lavenders are a bit classic this way. They can look like they're really covered, particularly in bumblebees, which draw your attention because they're so much larger. But most lavenders will be over in about 3 weeks. So if you're a pollinator, do you want something with a few flowers that keeps going for 20 weeks, or do you want something with lots of flowers but it's gone next week? So we combined both of those factors, and this is the top 10 that rank if you combine average pollinators per square metre times weeks of flowering, and this is now the average over the 9 years, combined 9 years that we have data for. And you'll see here, even within the top 10, that at the top, some attract a lot more pollinators than others. And I'll flick forward to the full 117, which I know you can't read, but you can see the angles. That's what happens if we go down to 117. Bear in mind, these were mainly focusing on recommended plants in the first place. Some really don't attract many. So if you've got a limited area in your garden, it is important that you don't go into the garden centre and buy something that looks pretty. That's not really going to do the job from a pollinator perspective. Great if you're only gardening for aesthetics, but if you're gardening for wildlife, it's helpful to be planting the right things, and they do vary enormously. The top one here, Calamenta nipita, you can see if we look at the bar, it's got a good range. It's got a reasonable number of the yellow honeybee, bumblebees and solitary bees, but it even has a few hoverflies and butterflies as well. If you drop down to number 3, Geranium roseanne, you can see the ratio is quite different. More than 50% of the pollinators that arrive on a Geranium roseanne will be some very tiny solitary bees, usually Lasioglossums, but sometimes also others, Chelostomas and things. So variety in how many they attract, also considerable variety in which pollinators by group they attract. And that's allowing for solitary bees really being quite a mixed bag. Full ranking, you've seen that. Interestingly, when we looked at the ranking we originally had in Oxfordshire honey, and compared the same plants for maple, there was less difference than we had imagined. In fact, the top three were still the top three, but just in a different order. There were some factors that we realized were subtly influencing things. Some of the plants were not as happy as others, as well as the population of pollinators having differed. Some plants just were not keen on it being that bit wetter in Wales. But then some things, like the Nepeta mucinii on the top right-hand side, actually did better than they had done previously. But that is because the gardener in me cheated. I knew that plant didn't like where I'd put it in the Oxfordshire flower bed. So here, I put it next to a raised wall area of the research bed where it had maximum drainage, and the plant said, thank you, that's the right conditions. So it does reinforce that paying attention to which plants will like your conditions is still really important. One of the things that we've always been fascinated with, and it kind of goes contrary to some of the research and some of the advice you get on planting for pollinators, is that we don't think that native versus non-native plants makes a lot of difference. So here you've got the data for honey versus maple and the weeks of the year along the bottom. And the lines represent average bees per square meter for each of those weeks. And you can see, particularly in the top set of lines, there was a really, really close correlation between the average bees per square meter on native versus non-native UK plants. And slight deviation for the latter part of the year on the bottom set, and we're still studying that, but we think it's actually because we had a slightly different set of plants and a slightly smaller sample, so it's not as robust. You combine it all together, and it still really shows strongly that the bees aren't bothered. The one thing that it does also show, though, even on the bottom chart, is that the non-native plants can attract more pollinators than the native. And also, you'll notice that the green lines don't start until about week 16, week 17. That is because our native herbaceous perennials that would have grown in our water meadows, or in our, not in woodlands but in sunny areas, really don't start flowering until the trees have finished flowering, the hedges have finished flowering, and then when the perennials kick in. But with some of the non-native plants, they're very important to extend the flowering season, because nobody's told a wallflower that originated in Greece and has now been planted in the UK and is triggered by light levels that there aren't that very many pollinators around. It just sees the light triggers and off it goes. Catherine, you mentioned crocuses. Crocuses are not crocuses, snowdrops. Snowdrops are non-native to the UK, but very important to give that early boost of pollen and nectar to our insects. So having done all this research, our findings were, we had 5 findings that we had originally, all of which still hold true. Number of pollinators varies greatly from plant to plant. The number of the type of specific pollinators vary. Native, non-native doesn't much matter. It's important that the plant is happy in its conditions, because an unhappy plant isn't going to thrive and produce as many flowers and attract as many insects. And weather has a significant impact. So our new findings were simply that the plants remained surprisingly consistent in spite of all the other changes we'd thrown at them. But honeybees really do have an influence. You reduce the amount of honeybees and you allow other species, and particularly the small solitary bees, more of a chance. That's the pictures of our top 3 performers. The calamint, which is a sort of knee-high growing herb, which is taste-wise, it's because it's a culinary herb, so somewhere between mint and oregano, but it makes a very nice tea. Oreganum, the one that did very well with of all the oreganums we've tried, is this white flowering subspecies hirtum. It has more flowers on each of the little bits of the ends of the stem, so keeps going for longer. And that's why it wins. It wins because it flowers for about 10 weeks, where some oreganums, most of the rest are over in about 6 or 7. And Geranium Rosanne, which is a garden designer's favourite because it flowers for many weeks and spreads its arms around and gives a great blaze of colour. It's a wonderful, attractive plant. It flowers and flowers and flowers because it's sterile, but no one's told the plant, so it still carries on flowering, trying to set seed, but unable to do so. It's a bit of a shame for the plant, but it's great for the pollinators because it's producing nectar all that time. If you were looking at it from a group perspective, I just did a quick table of which are best for bumblebees, solitary bees, honeybees, hoverflies, butterflies. Interestingly, you notice that oreganum actually turns up in 3 of those boxes, although it doesn't quite come top overall. Calamint does. I've also added in here, although I can't say we've measured it because I didn't go out counting at night, is that the plants that appear to do very well for night flying pollination, moths, are ones where they were in our trials but produce masses of seed, and yet I never really see very many pollinators on them, which means they're being pollinated when I'm not looking, presumably at night. So the verbascums, evening primrose and gara get added in for this category, even though you would struggle to find them on our ranking chart. They'd be quite further down. So in summarise, to be able to help pollinators in your garden, you've seen the lists of plants there, and all of that is on our website with more details so you can study it. But if you're trying to fill a border, because our study doesn't cover hedges and trees and things like that that flower earlier, you want to maximise your flowers from May to October, which is when your gardens are a substitute for the flower meadows that we have lost in the broader landscape. Plant as much in sun as you can, because most pollinators really are loath to pollinate, go into shade for their food. Some will. Bumblebees, fluffier ones, can keep their body temperatures up in shade. But if you've got sun, please plant a load of flowers in it. And it is worth planting in blocks, maybe 3s and 5s. You don't need to do a square metre like I do, just because it makes it more efficient for pollinators to pop from flower to flower to flower. They don't have to waste as much energy flying to get their next mouthful. It's a complicated story. This is actually our entire research shown on a pretty chart that my husband decided to do, and I couldn't resist using it. We will do more. We're done for this phase of research, but I'm interested in studying some of our meadows and other things. And that's all I have. That's our contact details. If anybody has questions, then I'm happy to take them.